Greetings, I'm Dr. Doug Campbell, and as we begin, I've got myself some coffee here just to provide a little bit of fuel. I, of course, take it black and as bitter as my soul.
It is by will alone I set my mind in motion. It is by the juice of safu that thoughts acquire speed, the lips acquire stains, the stains become a warning. It is by will alone I set my mind in motion.
Because who doesn't like to get wired on a chemical stimulant like caffeine and pretentiously argue with their friends about everything that's wrong with the world and how to fix it? If you're a college student who likes to drink coffee and engage in conversation at the local Starbucks, you're following in the footsteps of the Enlightenment philosophes, participants in a 17th and 18th century intellectual and cultural movement. Those guys used to congregate in coffee houses and the salons of noble patrons to wittily banter about the leading social ideas of the day and to offer suggestions for how to improve that stuff. In the words of the historian Peter Gay, the Enlightenment philosophes pursued a vastly ambitious program of secularism, humanity, cosmopolitanism, and freedom. Sounds great. But was this cultural movement really all it was cracked up to be? A force for freedom and progress in human history? Or was the Enlightenment just BS? Let's talk about it and drink coffee. So if we're talking about the Enlightenment, probably the first thing that comes to mind is a long laundry list of smarty-pants authors, thinkers, and intellectuals. In Britain, figures like Hume, Locke, or Adam Smith. Across the channel, we've got people like Voltaire, Diderot, Montesquieu, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. In the German-speaking lands, we're talking about Herder, Lessing, Immanuel Kant. Even in what would eventually become the United States, figures like Jefferson, Paine, and Franklin qualify as bona fide Enlightenment figures. And those are just the marquee names. There were a lot of folks involved, and they didn't necessarily agree about everything. For that matter, they lived in different times, in different places. I mean, the Enlightenment is generally held to have started sometime in the late 1600s and continued throughout the 1700s. So it was a pretty diverse movement, and individual philosophes might have disagreed with one another about a whole host of issues. So calling this all by one nice neat label perhaps implies a unity of thought that wasn't really there. That said, however, the label isn't completely artificial and indeed was used at the time across numerous different languages. Enlightenment in English, Siècle des Lumières in French, Aufklärung in German. We can even point to a contest which was held to define the term Enlightenment. Famously, the guy who won it was one of the most prominent metaphysicians of the 18th century, a dude named Immanuel Kant. And in his essay, Was ist Aufklärung? What is Enlightenment? He defined the term like so. Enlightenment is man's emergence from his self-imposed immaturity. Immaturity is the inability to use one's own understanding without another's guidance. This immaturity is self-imposed if its cause lies not in a lack of understanding, but in indecision and lack of courage to use one's own mind without another's guidance. Dare to know. Have the courage to use your own understanding is therefore the motto of the Enlightenment. And I think there are certain things that we can point to as common tendencies among Enlightenment thinkers. To start with, they all tended to be critical of tradition as a guide to organize society.
It is fools like you who have blocked progress throughout the ages. You make pronouncements on half-facts that you don't understand anyway.
I find your tone and manner highly objectionable, sir. But if you wish to involve yourself in an argument about it, pray explain the word progress in this context.
You wouldn't understand it. But I will give you a parallel that you may just appreciate. Had man not been given to invention and experiment, then tonight, sir, you would have eaten your dinner in a cave. You would have strewn the bones about the floor and then wiped your fingers on a coat of animal skin. In fact, your lapels do look somewhat greasy. Good night.
The Enlightenment came on the heels of the so-called scientific revolution of the 1500s and 1600s, where a series of observations and investigations demonstrated that kind of the old way of understanding the natural world had been flawed. The most famous example is Copernicus's demonstration that rather than the Earth being at the center of the universe and everything revolving around it, rather in our neighborhood of the universe, the sun is at the center of things and everything, the Earth included, revolves around it. Which, that's not a small thing to be wrong about.
If you base medicine on science, you cure people. If you base the design of planes on science, they fly. If you base the design of rockets on science, they reach the moon. It works, bitches.
And if all of the traditionally accepted wisdom that was endorsed by the powers that be, church authorities at the time, that sort of thing, if they were wrong about something that massive, what reason did anybody have to trust them when it came to all of the other important questions?
He told me the moon was an egg, Khaleesi. That once there were 2 moons in the sky, but one wandered too close to the sun and it cracked from the heat. Out of it poured 1,000 dragons, and they drank the sun's fire.
Moon is no egg. Moon is goddess, wife of sun. It is known.
It is known.
Maybe this is the way we've always done it is not a good enough reason to keep doing it that way. Maybe there is a better way to organize human affairs. Although obviously, if you're not going to use tradition as a guide, you've got to have some principle to structure how you do things. And for most Enlightenment thinkers, that principle was that of human reason. This notion that all human beings possess this innate faculty to observe and to understand things. This carries with it sort of an implicit assumption that there is an underlying order to reality, that stuff makes sense, and through the use of reason, human beings can make sense of that stuff. So, most Enlightenment thinkers argued that reason should be the guide to structure human affairs. That's kind of the starting point of the Enlightenment.
No, shut up! You all have the brains. Pudding! Look at you. I kind of made a decent species. Planet of the pudding brains.
Going hand in hand with that was the Enlightenment's optimistic vision of human nature. This was certainly at odds with medieval Christianity's understanding of human nature as fundamentally sinful and corrupt, dating back to original sin and Adam and Eve's expulsion from the Garden of Eden. Instead of that, the Enlightenment argued that human beings were at birth good and rational. Enlightenment thinkers then tended to argue that if human beings ended up being bad, that this was not so much the fault of a fallen or sinful human nature, but rather it was the fault of flaws in the way society was structured.
I'm not bad. I'm just drawn that way.
And if you fixed that flawed society, you would fix the flaws in human behavior. So there is this tremendous optimism in the perfectibility of humanity, that if you just structure society in the right way, you can sort of engineer environments that will allow human beings to live out lives of goodness and rationality. Unsurprisingly, with those sorts of views, Enlightenment philosophers tended to be pretty critical of the societies in which they were living and argued for ways in which they ought to be reformed. Going hand in hand with this went a certain sort of cosmopolitanism, a willingness to look outside of European society for models and examples. For example, we already mentioned coffee. That became a fad in the 1700s, sort of in imitation of the coffee houses in the Ottoman Empire. Likewise, a lot of Enlightenment thinkers looked to the Chinese example and the doctrines of Confucianism that argued for government based on merit rather than birth, or even to the New World and the model of the quote-unquote noble savage, which obviously, there's a certain amount of condescension that is bundled in with that concept, but the notion that American Indian populations, by being closer to nature, were less corrupted by the evils of society and more in touch with the fundamental goodness of their nature. Another notion that most Enlightenment thinkers were really into was the notion of the quote-unquote natural rights of man. Today we would probably call it human rights, but the basic idea is the same. We're talking about the notion that all human beings are entitled to certain basic rights simply by virtue of being born. That these are not based on social status or one's family lineage or the blood that flows through one's veins, but that they are the common entitlement of all human beings. Presumably, this is recognizable as a very influential idea in the modern world. And it sounds very attractive. Obviously, though, one of the difficulties involved in this is, how do you know what the natural rights of man are? How do we define them? How do we know that these rights exist, and what are they? And various Enlightenment thinkers had various ways of answering this question. Perhaps the most famous formulation was that of the English philosopher John Locke, who argued that the natural rights of man included life, liberty, and property. But others tended to parse this different ways. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, for example, tended to prize social equality a little bit more and argued against private property as a natural right. And even today, there are ongoing arguments about this. Is access to healthcare, is that a human right? Is access to, say, broadband internet, is that a human right? I think these are reasonable discussions that can be had, and the fact that it is debatable and debated indicates that there is some murkiness here. But at any rate, that's what we're talking about when we're talking about the Enlightenment, is a movement that tended to argue against tradition and for human reason, for human goodness, and for all human beings as being entitled to certain basic and inalienable human rights. If that's the case, what's not to like about any of that? What is there to criticize? Well, certainly at the time, there is a conservative reaction against the Enlightenment. People who tended to prize tradition argued that the Enlightenment was far too radical and that these newfangled ideas were far too abstract to provide an appropriate foundation for human societies. They argued that human traditions were valuable and should not be cast aside lightly. And I think those sorts of conservative critiques of Enlightenment ideas, they began in the 18th century and they've continued ever since. Also, one can point to some of the blind spots of the Enlightenment. We talked about the natural rights of man. That's gendered language. And indeed, for most Enlightenment thinkers, when they talk about man, they don't just mean human beings in general, but specifically dudes, people with Y chromosomes. Men. Indeed, can take it further and say that there is an implied white men for most Enlightenment thinkers as well, that they are holding up, despite some of their cosmopolitanism, this sense of their own particular group as being more entitled to these rights than women or other ethnicities or races. And indeed, some scholars have highlighted the way in which many Enlightenment thinkers actively advanced sexist and racist ideas to bolster their own privileges. That said, there are certain counterexamples. There are a not insignificant number of prominent women who were participants in the Enlightenment. We could point to figures like Émilie de Châtelet, Olympe de Gouges, Margaret Cavendish, Mary Wollstonecraft. There are fewer examples of people of color participating in the Enlightenment, but there is at least one, a guy named Anton Wilhelm Amo, who was born in Ghana, but made his way to Europe, eventually got a PhD, and became a philosopher of not insignificant reputation. Spent several decades in Europe before returning to Africa. So, it's not entirely a white male movement. Could also point to Marxist critiques of the Enlightenment, arguing that this program of natural rights actually conceals some of the interests of the wealthy propertied classes in society. Indeed, hardly accidental that these notions of natural rights, going back to John Locke, often included the notion of private property as a fundamental natural right. That this sort of leftist critique of the Enlightenment tends to argue that, as long as you enshrine those inequalities in terms of private property, it doesn't matter what powers the government has. That will fundamentally serve to secure their stranglehold over the entire society at the expense of the poor and powerless. There is also a postmodernist critique of the Enlightenment. Postmodernism is a radically skeptical and relativist movement that tends to argue that behind every set of discourses lurks a set of power interests. Probably the most prominent guy advancing these sorts of ideas is the French philosopher Michel Foucault, and his work argued that the Enlightenment's mania for reason and for order led it to try and organize society in such a way that those outside the norm were defined as sort of deviant or aberrant, that they were pathologized and ultimately consigned to the ranks of the insane or criminals confined to asylums and prisons and stuff like that.
You merely adopted the dark. I was born in it, molded by it. I didn't see the light until I was already a man.
The Enlightenment contained inherently authoritarian tendencies. Recommended sources for you to check out. We mentioned Immanuel Kant's essay, What is Enlightenment, from 1784. That's relatively brief and certainly a good starting point for defining what the Enlightenment is. Peter Gay's 2-volume The Enlightenment, An Interpretation, from 1965 and 1969. It's a little old, but still a very worthwhile, detailed treatment of the Enlightenment's history and values and some of the most prominent thinkers involved in the Enlightenment. If you're interested in some of the critiques of the Enlightenment from a Marxist perspective, Ellen Meiksins Wood's Liberty and Property, A Social History of Western Political Thought from the Renaissance to the Enlightenment, published in 2012, does an excellent job of linking the intellectual history of the Western tradition to social conditions and power structures. It's a very interesting book. And finally, we mentioned Michel Foucault. He was a brilliant guy. His writing tends to be very dense, but there is some worthwhile stuff packed into there. Particularly of note, you might check out Madness and Civilization, A History of Insanity in the Age of Reason, from 1961, or Discipline and Punish, The Birth of the Prison, from 1975, both of which talk about the ways in which Enlightenment discourses tended to marginalize and pathologize those who were a little bit different in those societies. So what about our verdict? Was the Enlightenment B.S.? I suppose that's a matter of opinion. If you're asking me mine, though, even acknowledging all of the flaws of the Enlightenment, and I think the criticisms of this movement are valid, still, I think it remains a movement that fundamentally argues for the emancipation of human beings and for humans to live a life as free and flourishing as it can possibly be. And, even some of the critiques of the Enlightenment, tend to be more along the lines of the Enlightenment not living up to its own ideals, or even the Marxist or postmodernist criticisms of the Enlightenment, in some ways are outgrowths of the Enlightenment's own critical stance and are using some of those critical methods against the Enlightenment. Like in some ways, they are at their foundation also children of the Enlightenment. So in that sense, the Enlightenment has been enormously influential. Even with all of the flaws, I would say the good still outweighs the bad, but make up your own mind. That's all for now. Do always remember to check your sources and evidence. See you later.